Hey, let's start the show.
For Thursday, June 30th, 2022. Welcome to This Is Only a Test, the official podcast of Tested.com. Hello and welcome to the podcast. This week I am Norm, and joining me is a new crew, a special guest this week. Kishore is out. Unfortunately, he really wanted to be here, but work has taken him away. But we have a wonderful show for you, a really great lineup. Joining me, first of all, is Tested contributor Sean Charlesworth.
Hello.
Sean, so good to see you.
Good to see you too, Norm.
We have a lot to catch up on.
I know.
I know I know you've been busy with the work you've been doing with Tippett Studio and all the personal projects. But we did have a video that just went live this week that I want to talk to you briefly about. But it's great to see you and a lot to catch up on. But we also have a very special second guest, another collaborator of yours, Sean, and first time on the podcast. This is Bill Krause, Bill Admiral Buck, a professional and hobbyist model maker. So good to see you. If you're watching the video, Bill, I have so many questions about your workspace and the stuff that you have in the background. But thanks for joining. And how are you doing?
Great. Thanks for having me here. You want to see what's back here?
Yeah. Oh, well, we'll have questions about. We'll get to all the different models that you make. But as a little bit of an introduction and why I had both of you on, this episode is going to be kind of a little bit Star Trek themed, but we're going to cover some of the pop culture things and some of the recent events in our world, a little bit of catch up. But I have you both on because both of you worked together, primarily for you, Bill, with some of the work you did on Star Trek Picard. Is that right?
That's correct. Yeah. We both worked on that. I designed some of the ships that were seen as a prop in the background for the ready room, the gold-plated ships that were seen on the Stargazer, the new Stargazer in season 2 of Picard. And Sean printed some of those for me. So he and I have collaborated last year building several of those.
And Picard season 2, of course, has been wrapped. This was in the first episode, I believe, right? The Stargazer. This is the new Stargazer, right? The one that Rios is the captain of. And if fans of Star Trek may know, I believe it was it started in Next Generation, where the ready room and the conference room had the models of the ships along the wall. Was that right? That Picard had of all the different enterprises?
I think you did see it in some of the earlier movies with Kirk. I think in Star Trek 6, A Discovered Country, there was a wall that had these half profiles of the Enterprise. They were gold painted at the time, but then they were later seen in, trying to think, in other movies, I think Generations, was it? No, First Contact had models that
tears it off the wall, right? He slams it in the whole speech with the Moby Dick speech with with Lily. That's right. He broke his toys. He broke his ships. Right. I believe he broke his little ships. And it's always been, I think, like a fun tradition, I think, in Star Trek, especially the later shows, that having models. It's a little part of the world building. Right? I think, in Enterprise, the TV show, the opening, you saw glimpses of ships that some were just concept art, CG models, but telling the history of as yet not the Federation at that point, but even in, I believe it was Star Trek. The second one, not Star Trek Beyond, Star Trek Into Darkness, when they're meeting with Peter Weller, the Admiral, he has on his desk, he has some of those actual models. I believe model makers from Quantum Mechanics, I believe, did some of those. For the tabletop. Yeah. So a long tradition of extra world building in the physical space. And of course, the physical models that were built for the original series and Next Generation up through First Contact, the movie. But we're going to get to the models that you guys worked on, of course. But we did want to do a little bit of catch up because, Sean, you and I haven't talked Lego in a long time.
I know.
And this past weekend, I was over at Bricks by the Bay, which is our local Bay Area Lego convention, which you've been to, Sean, right?
I have. I feel bad. I feel so bad. It totally passed me by. Like I totally missed it. Like I didn't even realize it was happening. That's what happens during a pandemic. You just lose all track. But yeah, we have been. I have been a few times with you and testing. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. I and it completely I assume you were going to be there, so which is why I didn't reach out. It was the first time back after a couple of years. This is Lego conventions. I think Lego recently did their own live stream from the Lego house over in their headquarters in Denmark. But these are kind of independent conventions that pop up. They got a reserve, a big hotel ballroom, a local small. It's not, Anaheim Convention Center. It's not San Diego Comic-Con. This is more like the kind of small ballroom size conventions. And they invite builders in the rough area, so Bay Area, Southern California, along the West Coast, to bring their builds, because some of these things are very fragile. And so it was great to see some familiar faces, great to check out some really amazing, creative, my own creations, all different themes from your medieval themes, your space themes, and even there's the contraption series.
That's nice.
Yeah, the Great Ball GBC, Great Ball contraption.
Yeah, those are good.
Yeah, so if you haven't seen that, it's like expandable. How would you describe that? It's almost like model trains, but but with moving a ball from point A to point B, and the builder has whatever free reign to design mechanisms to get a ball from one end to another, right?
Yeah.
And then
it was. I remember in a past Bricks by the Bay that we went to, we met. Austin and his mom, who are building the crazy Blade Runner-esque Lego silly. Did you
a cityscape? Yeah,
guys again.
They weren't there again, but there was a really cool cityscape, one Chinatown theme, so using Lunar New Year sets and a lot of custom minifigs, dragons everywhere. Really interesting tiling of the roofs. So a lot of people do that kind of. They start with one building and then they build entire city block of buildings. Architecture is a big thing there. So we saw an 8-foot tall Eiffel Tower, all Technic, based on the blueprints of the actual Eiffel Tower, using with working elevators on the inside. And then on the site, you'll see, in terms of a scale model, there was a minifig, so 1/40th scale. I think minifig is 1/40th and 1/45th scale recreation of the Airbus A380 jetliner. So the largest passenger jet in the world at minifig scale. And he's a kid. It's basically an 18-year-old kid who builds it. The way he does it, he doesn't do any of it in CAD. He does it with inkjet printer printouts of orthogonal views, profile views of the airplane, and then just builds the wing box on top of that, and then gets all the dimensions correct.
That's really it's very interesting to see whether it's Lego or traditional model building like Bill does, how people approach it. Because for those of you who don't know, they're Lego put out a digital designing kit where you can digitally build whatever you want, which is a great way to work out builds when you don't necessarily have all the parts yet. But that may not work for some people, digging through that digital bin. I love the on paper thing.
Well, also it doesn't account for the physics. It doesn't do simulation for weight and balance. Right. All it is just it's just fixed pieces. But I mentioned that because, Bill, in your Starship model making, you use kind of profile printouts as well, right? You use references and in the physical world.
Yeah, I use a lot of reference in a lot of my designs from automotive, aerospace, any kind of transportation thing from a certain period of time, and a lot of all sorts of forms and contours and shapes and things from aircraft and you name it. And it's just part of my design ethos. I think that what inspires me that I see, I want to make into a spaceship. Is basically what looks good, looks cool, make a spaceship out of it.
And I think we heard a lot of like similar ethos with like the design of the Enterprise from the J.J. Abrams films. You know, they called it the hot rod because they evoked a lot of those curves in that mid-century era of cars. Essentially, they had that sleek look, even though it's also the classic Jeffries two nacelle design doesn't work unless it's in zero gravity, right? There is no, it's made to look unbalanced because it's supposed to be like a ship that just exists in space.
Yeah, when I'm building a ship for a certain era, I look at who designed other ships in that era. If you talk about Jeffries and things that inspired him, so you have to look at things that were in that era. The airplanes and cars of the 50s and 60s are what inspired him to design his Enterprise. So if you look at what Probert did, he was a generation beyond this. So he's looking at things that were existing at the time then. So when I design ships for those eras, I think through the eyes of a Jeffries or a Probert and try to make a ship that fits that era based on the reference that they had at the time.
And then the tools they had at that time too, I imagine. There's a look to a sculpted or a scratch-built styrene ship that's very different than the look of a ship that originated necessarily in CAD.
Right. A lot of the details, even on a ship or a model built in the 60s, is going to look a lot different than anything that's designed now, because now everything is built in 3D. You can get crazy with all sorts of very fine details and things that would be really hard to make by hand back in the day. So when you're building new models today that have to fit an era back in the 60s, you can leave a lot of that stuff off because you can really fall down a rabbit hole of throwing a lot of detail on things, but you don't need that depending on what you're building.
One of the stories that I learned recently, I was actually at the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum. We were doing some video shoots there, and they have, of course, the original 12-foot filming model of the Enterprise. And we were in the restoration lab where timing was just right. They had brought the Enterprise back into the lab to do some repair of the lighting because the ship was restored back in 2015. And it's at the National Mall, but the Smithsonian's also doing a renovation there. So there was a chance for them to bring the ship back in. Of course, no touching it, but we got to get pretty close to it. And one of the details that we noticed, or that was pointed out to us from the conservationists, is that the conservator is that they only modeled some of the exterior details on one side of the ship because it was only going to be filmed from one side. So the nacelle details were only on, I believe, if you're looking at the starboard side of the nacelles. And for shots of the ship going the other direction, they would just replace the decals with mirrored images and flip the image of it when they filmed it. So nice. An effective part of model making, which which only makes sense to do if you have the constraint of the physical build, because digitally you could, of course, detail and copy and paste and mirror however you wanted to. So Bill, speaking of conventions, I saw on Instagram, you're Admiral Buck on Instagram. People should absolutely follow you because you post wonderful photos of your Starship builds. But you were also at a small convention that's been going on for a long time now, Wonderfest. Is that in Louisville? Is that right?
Right, Louisville, Kentucky. And I think it's been going on for decades, I believe. And it's primarily a model sci-fi horror convention, miniature sculptures with a huge dealer's room. And I wouldn't call it a small convention. It's actually pretty big. I mean, the model show itself probably this year, I think, had almost 1,000 model entries in the show. Wow. And there's guests and panels and, like I said, a huge dealer's room. So it's 3 days of a lot of fun for us sci-fi nerds.
It's a destination we would love to go to. It's funny because I follow a bunch of different artists working in different genres on Instagram, and a bunch of them were there. because like you said, it's not just for science fiction ships. You have creature sculpts, you have people who are doing small batch resin kits who are there. There are people with official licenses who are doing, and there are fewer of those companies, but licenses do like 1/6 scale, superhero inspired ships, or I think there was like a 1/6 scale Batwing from the 1989 Batman that was there.
Mm-hmm.
But you're there. Do you bring some of your ships to display and show and discuss?
I have in the past. I first started about 4 or 5 years ago as the impetus to build models for something, and it kind of got me back in the hobby. And I'd been entering pretty large models in the show the last couple of years. But this year, I was invited to come down and be a speaker and actually put on a panel on scratch building. And as well, I did a little panel with John Eves and Rick Sternbach talking about the ships from Picard. So that was a fun, wonderful experience to be sharing a stage with these guys. So I did not bring anything to share in the competition, but I was there just to enjoy the show and present.
Walking through the competition area, when you say there are like 1,000 models there, can you give us a sense of the range of models, what things caught your eye, some of the highlights from the show from this year?
Convention hall in a room with this rows and rows of tables, and there are many categories, and it's all divided from left to right as you walk in the front door. And there's all your sculpture and horror figurines and sculptures. And then there's rows of mech things and vehicles and Star Wars and Star Trek and Space 1999. There's a row and row and row of models and things to look at. And so you can spend a good couple hours just, involved in looking at all these wonderfully crafted models. And I'm trying to think what else. There's actually, I think, another category where they have props. There's a lot of handheld props.
Oh, cool. I didn't know they did that. Man, I got to go.
But this year I did not spend a lot of time in the model room. I was so busy doing other things that was one thing that normally when I go there, that's all I do is I just stare at all these models. But this year I was so busy doing everything else that I just walked the room for like 5 minutes and I was like, I got to go someplace else. So
because you're a celebrity now, Bill. So
I guess
it's the sacrifice you have to make.
Since I didn't have anything in the show, it's like, I don't care. No.
So do they have like a Star Trek area, Star Wars area, miscellaneous starship area, or is it all just kind of mixed in together?
It's kind of mixed all together. It depends. It's not categorized or arranged by genre, but it's basically these are spaceship models, and you'll have everything on a table, everything you can imagine. I think some of the mechs, there's probably like 24 categories, and but they're so spread out it's hard to identify where everything is. But you can see through the middle of the room, there's all your sculpture on the left side, and there's all your models on the right side. And within each of those sections, they're divided into their subcategories.
I'd be real curious going through there and chatting. I mean, one of the reasons I want to go is the world of model making has certainly evolved, and there's been a resurgence of interest, but also in the tools available for model makers. And I feel like because of resin 3D printing, because of availability of cheap electronics and lighting, it's maybe easier than ever for someone to dive in, and the digital modeling tools, the web-based tools. Do you get a sense that there's a shift to that, from what you saw, or were a lot of people there still also just kitbashing and scratch building, and what was the kind of vibe between those different types of models on display, or the model makers there?
Well, it's hard to tell once a model is finished and painted on the table how it was conceived and built. So you're looking at this beautiful works of art, and how it was made is kind of secondary, but just looking at people building stuff online and the tools they're using. So yeah, there's a lot of more digital tools being used, a lot of printing, whether in the sculpture or even in the hard surface models of spaceships. But in the convention room, you'll see a lot of kits. People build a lot of kits, or they're printing their own things. In between, you'll see kitbash stuff, which could encompass some printing as well as some out-of-box type things, and you'll see all sorts of creations based on whatever you have in front of you. So whether it be a found object or something you actually designed on a computer and then printed yourself. Whatever gets you to what you want to make, you'll find on the table.
I love that. I love that the way things have progressed with the digital stuff is that we are now creating digital models of pieces of old models to act as the correct greeblies on all these ships. It's such a weird path. I love that the digital era has made that a possibility to do.
It's just another tool, and you can either go try to find the part in some obscure box but you buy on eBay, or you can just make it yourself digitally and print out your own set of greebles. In fact, you can even do that digitally on your own. They actually kit bash your parts that you may have on the computer, something on the computer, and then print the whole thing out as one piece. So there's digital kit bashing, and then just printing out parts one at a time, and then doing it, old-fashioned way. So however you want to do it, it's another tool.
And especially if the model is being used for some type of production or show, like what John Knoll and the team at ILM did for Rogue One, they created a digital library, of kit bashing ingredients, so that when they did that Star Destroyer, they could pull in, the exact, their version of the models off of sprues from World War II model kits, and they'd have to go to eBay because they would have a digital model that would work at the scale that they wanted to, and take this kit bashing sensibilities in their sculpting.
Exactly, and we were going to do that when we had to rebuild the next generation Constellation Stargazer. So we were to build all three of them for the show, the three new Stargazers, and there's the new one, the Sagan class that came from production from Doug Drexler, who designed, and along with Dave Blass and John Eves. And that was ready to go as a printed piece. And then I had to design and build a TOS very first Stargazer, which I did digitally. But the middle one, the one that we first saw, and the next generation, was designed and built by Rick Sternbach. And it was a kit bash thing. He just built it out of parts he had found online. He had, I think I didn't have online, but he had a whole collection of anime kits that he had in a couple of enterprises, and he built this the old-fashioned way out of a plastic styrene. And we found that it was easier to do that again than to try to do it digitally and print it. So we went on eBay and bought all the same kits that he had sourced to build his Constellation, and had a couple of old primaries from Motion Picture Kit, and we built it almost exactly the way he did originally, and all plastic, all styrene. And that was only one out of the three that was done the traditional method. So that was a lot of fun.
was that physical model scanned or digitized at any point after the physical build, or was it just the one?
We did as a one-off, and we sent it off. We got plated.
Oh my gosh, that's amazing! Yeah.
A good friend of ours, Lauren Oliver, who had built his own version of it a few years ago. He had done all the research in Legroom to identify all the right kits and the right measurements for everything. So he had all that ready to go. And I flew him out from Denver for a week to throw that thing together. Because we had, I think, about 2 months to build all three of them. And with that one, we did really quickly because we had everything ready to go. But
it's amazing. And of course, that legwork relies on the fan community, folks on the RPF and on the forums who are doing on their own time, building it for their own hobby and interest. When the needs of production come up, there's no way in 2 months they could have sourced, they would have generated a model at some point. It just wouldn't have had the fidelity and been to the satisfaction of the production team, the production designer, Dave Blass's team. But that's the love and passion that fans put into the show.
They had a digital model of the Constellation, and I looked at it, I go, it's not right. And I know it's not right. So we thought we can do better. I mean, we know it's only going to be seen in the background, but as fans, we're going to, if we know that we can do it right, we'll do it.
Yep.
Absolutely. Yeah. We recently, Prop Store had their big summer auction, and included, there was some miniatures from Star Trek, one of which I think came out of I think Doug Drexler had an old blog post about it, but it was a DS9 shuttlecraft, which was like a
Right.
repurposed shuttle when they needed it for a specific episode. And it was, again, complete one-off, but I got the chance to see it in person. It was just so beautifully detailed. I couldn't conceive of, I mean, you could tell just by looking at it, it was handmade. Even if it was a digitally designed model, there maybe wouldn't have been too much detail in certain parts, or it wouldn't have had the randomness of certain things. But it was just really cool to see it in person. All the mounting points, of course, and the hot lights that they had in there. And that model, I think, just sold for like $25,000 in that auction.
Nice.
Yeah.
Was that built by Greg?
It might have been built by Greg Jein. It might have. Yeah. I look up the post. It's funny because I looked up the post is actually on like a Wayback Machine Internet Archive blog post that Doug had written years and years ago, and he claims that the model was stolen. They lost it. Production had lost it at some point. So I don't know. I don't know how it ended up in the auction afterward. But it is now back in private hands. But it was cool. They have obviously documented it and photographed it, and we got a chance to film a video about it. But you mentioned Greg, and that's another reason that timing was kind of appropriate for you guys to jump on the show, because it was announced this past week that Greg Jein, who had worked on so many films and shows and so much of Star Trek, had passed away a couple months ago. And Bill, you might be the better person, the best out of all of us, to talk about Greg's work. If you have a chance to spend a few moments here just to let people out there know who Greg Jein was and what he did and why he was so important to the model making community.
Well, I think he's best remembered for all the iconic physical models he had built for so many movies that we all just took for granted, and then didn't realize that he was involved in all of these miniatures. That you're talking about, the large spacecraft from Close Encounters, the Dark Starship, most of the models from Star Trek: Next Generation, and on and on and on. And such a wonderful person, and I'm not sure I can talk much more about. I don't know him very well, but I know of his work, and only now after his passing have we found out. We really looked at the history of what he's done, and just being shocked by the volume of work that he worked on.
Yeah, Greg, I wasn't as familiar with Greg I knew the name. But it's one of those things where I knew the name, but I didn't know the massive amount that he had done. And you look at the list of oh my God, Close Encounters, Star Trek, it just it's so much. It's
Parker Banzai.
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't know he did that.
Yep.
I think that.
Go ahead.
I think that in the model making world, especially in the era of the peak of model making, right? We think of Kerner and we think of the ILM model shop as as the most well known, right? Because Star Wars and the popularity of Star Wars. And I think that so much of Star Trek and some of the syndicated shows that were done in the early 90s that use a lot of model making don't get as much love, or at least not in the mainstream community. And so, it wasn't all done. And certainly ILM, they did Enterprise E, for First Contact. But, all through the TV shows, it was small effect studios. And I think Greg worked for Boss Films. That's where some of the stuff, there's footage, I want to say, on Doug Drexler's Vimeo site, which I'll link to in the description of this is raw VHS footage of the team at Boss Films in not a big studio. We're talking about a small garage shop making the 4-foot Enterprise model for Next Generation that was used for the later seasons. And it's painstaking work. They're literally there, applying stencils, doing the Aztecing. Like there's some great photos of like making those giant fiberglass models. Or it's like, to make the saucers of those things, to cast those, you see like the giant rubber molds that they had to pull those out of. Like they're literally one-offs for a reason, because it was such a big team effort and so many person hours to make these things. And yeah, he was in the heart of it. I think Close Encounter is probably the one that you'll see him done. The lead on was that mothership.
I was just at the Udar Hazy Air and Space Museum. They have the mothership there.
They do.
If you guys get the chance to, it's not the main Smithsonian Air and Space, but they had it there, and it's really impressive. And you look at it and the amount of work that it must have taken to put that thing together, and then like. It's a well-known secret that they hit a lot of little interesting Greeblies all over. There's like an R2D2 and like a school bus and like all kinds of, like a mailbox. And so the challenge is, if you go to see it, you got to see if you can find all those weird things.
Yeah, it's a really beautiful model, and not a lot of that stuff is preserved because it's expensive to store, and they. We're not made necessarily to last, decades.
Hollywood's not sentimental.
Yeah. at that size too, at that scale.
Greg had also built the Stargazer, the filming production model, which was a little bit larger than the ready room model. So he had to replicate what was done by Rick Sternbach on a little bit larger scale, trying to replicate all the same parts that Rick had sourced from other anime kits, but make it a little bit larger so they can film it reasonably well on the studio. But we'd use that as a reference. It's a little bit different than the ready room model, but when we did ours for the show for Picard, we kind of used a little bit of both detail reference from both Greg's as well as Rick's Stargazer. So there's a little bit of Greg in our Picard version.
As fans of models and as people who work on models, is there a good repository of reference photos or of imagery, or like a documentary of the models made in that era? I know, for example, Disney's working, right? Ron Howard is working on a documentary about the ILM and the ILM model shop. But for things like Star Trek, like where do Star Trek fans look to find good behind the scenes imagery of the ships that were made in the late 80s and early 90s? And
well, I know Doug Drexler used to have a website, Drex Files. He had posted all of his documented photographs and artwork from when he worked on TNG and Deep Space Nine and Voyager and all those things. I think that site's no longer there, but when he was posting them, I was right-click saving all these images. But if you go to his Facebook page, I think he also shares a lot of that information there. But beyond that, if you don't know the actual artists involved, whether it's John Eaves or Rick Sternbach or Doug Drexler, and know that they have their own social media pages, you'll find that stuff there if they posted it. But other than that, it's really just a lot of Google searching and falling down other rabbit holes of images you're looking for. But it's hard to find.
Yeah. Yeah, and with Greg's passing, it just reminds us that these folks have been working in the business. They were very young when they started, but it's been decades since, and I would love for their stories to be commemorated and be told, and they're still working today, right? Doug, you said still doing some work with production and still very active. So it'd be cool for there to be like a definitive documentary work about the models and to dig up all those photos, which I'm sure are just printed photos and Polaroids and VHS tapes, and not all digitized at this point.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Well, I did want to spend some time, Bill, asking you about your model making and the work you currently do, which is different than necessarily the work you guys did for Picard. So maybe let's start with Picard and revisit and kind of put the end on the Stargazer story. Again, these were the golden ships, gold-plated ships that were in the Ready Room, much like the Ready Room designs of Next Generation, and we said like in some of the original series movies. They wanted the family of stargazers, the history of stargazers, right? Which we saw, of course, the new ship, the beautiful new Sagan class stargazer. There was the TNG stargazer, but there was also another stargazer that we had never seen before. Can you talk about the design of that one and also how these gold-plated ships were made?
Sure. I was actually contacted via Instagram by the showrunner, Terry Metalis, who was interested in me building the miniatures for the show, for the Ready Room. And I think it was John Eves who had suggested that he contacted me because John was the guy who was doing them in the past. He had done all the gold-plated Ready Room models for all the films and shows. So he kind of was pushing me toward Terry, and Terry's like, I love his stuff. So I was like, thanks. And he wanted me to not only build these gold-plated Ready Room models, but actually design one of them, which is a TOS predecessor to the TNG classic Constellation class stargazer that Picard commanded as first command. So I was tasked with designing a TOS version of that. And I thought that's my playground. I love that era, and given the free reign to do whatever I want, and they trusted me to design that ship. And I think I came up with like 6 different concepts, which I did digitally, all sorts of combinations of 4-engine, either X-wing, T-wing, H-wing, and some even had only 2 engines, because who's to say that the Stargazer only had 4 engines? I mean, the first one could have had anything, could have been a totally different ship. So I didn't know what they wanted to do, so I just gave them everything and said, well, pick something or pick certain things and we'll go from there. And they pretty much picked the first concept and said, go with this. I said, fine. And I had designed these in SketchUp 3D, so it was very quick for me to do that. And it's a very simple design, TOS being a very simplistic kind of a shape form, as well as these being a gold-plated Ready Room model. They don't need a lot of detail. There's pretty much a windowless little smooth thing that you'll see in the background. So basically they're true trophies. So it can be pretty slim on the details, and it makes it easier to design and then print. And once they approved the design, I sent that 3D file over to Sean, and then he broke it apart into a printable format where you can engineer the interior to be reinforced with a brass rod, because we know it's going to be set on a set and would be under lighting for a good part of the day. And they also requested that you have 2 mounting points, one for the side and one for the bottom, not knowing on the set how they might want to position it. So we had to engineer how that little cross section might be embedded in the model. So we made the combinations for that. And then they broke it into pieces. So once Sean had printed it, he sent me all the parts, and I had to reassemble all those into the model. And I think I sent them at least the TOS version as a single model that they then plated. The Constellation was also sent as a single model. Sagan was sent with the engine separate because they were very fragile. They're all about 2 feet long, and all during the production, as I was making the models, it was always implied that they would be painted and not plated, even though John Eves had given me the heads up on how they should be prepared prior to being plated, where they're being dunked into these vats of liquid for the plating process. They need to be solid with no voids in at all. And what I gave them was not solid. They had plenty of voids in them. So because the liquid would eventually eat through the any kind of gap and then cause the plating to etch. And I think they're plated in a copper first, and then the gold is then electroplated to that. So they look good for a while while they're on camera. They're in one shot for 1 second behind Jerry Ryan's head. So they looked great for that second. Beyond that, the lifespan, they start to deteriorate. So when we made more for season 3, we made sure that they were heavy, solid resin models, so they survived the plating process. And
I remember when you found out that
we sent them off the plater. What?
Yeah, because that was doubtful because like the way we designed it for 3D printing, because these are 2 feet long. So one of the major jobs I was in charge of was hollowing it out. So you had about 2.5 millimeter thick walls, so it'd be relatively strong. And there's some random other supports that I put inside, like in the saucer, so we didn't get any sagging or anything. But then the rest of it was hollow, so that you save on weight and resin costs. It prints better that way, all that stuff. And so then they had to, I guess they
had to drill holes in
it because it would float. So they drilled holes in it so it'd sink. And also, I have no idea how electroplating chemicals would react with the resins we use for 3D printing. So it was very lucky that everything turned out as well as it did. Yeah.
Yeah, it was. I mean, the resin and electroplating is fine. You just can't have that liquid inside the model, after it's been plated, because it'll leak out, which is what it did, and caused some problems with that version. Those versions of the Red models, but we fixed that in season 3. They're fine. So
that's amazing. That's so. I mean, and that's the kind of the how far production would go to create these bridges and ready rooms that were so immersive. These real. I mean, the video tours I've seen of the Stargazer Bridge, and I think I've seen Michael Okuda and Denise Okuda do like a walking tour through, and we're shown like not only they have the Elcar's aesthetic, but it's all modernized with these curved giant panels and these translucent panels, and they're using all sorts of the actual cutting edge in display technology for the set decoration, for the production. And just as back then it was video screens, but it looks so seamless, just as it does back then as well. So it's just like it's a playground really for Star Trek fans to work on that show. Yeah. But Bill, you also do models that you make that are not gold plated, that look like miniatures at scale, like 1/350 at scale, or I guess depending, you should tell us like what the sizing of iconic ships as well as ships of your own design. And so can you walk us through what it takes to make a pretty sizable miniature of something like an Intrepid class ship or one that you've designed?
Yeah, 1/350 scale is a nice scale because it allows you to get your hands in there and do some really nice detail and lighting. And they are fairly large though. So you're looking at a TOS Enterprise at 1/350 is about 3 feet long. So it's a hefty model, and the kits that are available for both the Enterprise, TOS, and refit, they're 32 to 35 inches long, and they are large models. And I build my own designs that look like they fit in the Star Trek universe, in that same scale. And since there are no kits available for stuff I design, I have to start with building an armature, which I do in all my models. I build it out of brass, and it's soldered together so it withstands and holds the weight of the model parts. So whether they're printed or I scratch build the components, I have something to hang them on. And because I can't rely on tabs and things fitting together like a normal model would. So the skeleton, the armature is the first thing that gets made after I've designed a ship, which I would do either on a computer and then print plans for. And then I'll send either those parts or the model itself to, say, Sean, and he may start printing pieces, or I may even modify existing model parts, other kit parts. The current one I'm working on is the Excalibur. It's a TOS era heavy cruiser, but it's not the Enterprise, and it's nothing else you've seen before. It's kind of a hybrid between TOS and the motion picture. So the only thing I'm keeping out of that model kit, which was the donor kit, is the primary hull, which I've modified greatly, but that's the only part of that kit that I'm using. Everything else is going to be printed. The pylons, the nacelles, the secondary hull, it's all brand new and custom. So those will be printed, resin printed, and they're large. So and Sean has access to a large scale or large format printer, so he's able to do these very big pieces for me. And once those are in my hands, and I'll start assembling them. And this is about a good 6 to 7 month long process from start to finish, from when I design something to getting it, starting to build an armature and the components and develop a lighting plan and where things are going to go. And if there's any kind of interior spaces, I have to build and design those, or use a 35 millimeter backlit slide to replicate an interior space, so I don't have to build them, which is, I think, more details. You can get really fine detail in a very small area with a backlit film than trying to build something like that in that scale. And then you get into the finish work and painting and weathering and custom decals and markings, and it could take a while. And but these are year-long projects.
Oh my gosh. I'm looking at, on your Instagram page, your Project Excalibur, just the armature assembly, which you have mounted to wood. And something I love is that you annotate everything. Like you're noting things down. Like there's so much detail in the it looks like it's a physical blueprint of the ship before the hull gets put on. It's meticulous.
Yeah, thanks. It feels like you're really building the real thing, because I kind of get something out of it. Because when I'm spending this much time on a model, I want to feel like, well, I'm really building a real starship. And even though it's small, a Star Trek style ship is very delicate. You look at the pylons, and there's these thin little things holding these gigantic engines. And you just can't assume you're going to glue these things together. They're going to stay there, and they're going to be parallel to each other, and they're not going to sag or droop. So the armature guarantees that everything's going to stay together and be aligned. And if you you design that ahead of time, and you cut the pieces, and you design the skeleton to ensure that you're going to be not having any problems later on, because aligning the cells is always the hard part. And if they're a little bit off, you'll look at it and be bugged by it forever, because you got to make sure they're both parallel, and the XYZ axis are all the same, because one's drifting a little bit off, just a little bit.
Right. No good.
Symmetry is so important on the left, right. Yeah. Of
right.
ship.
So and these jigs that, when you're.
It's like Norm said earlier, these are only meant to exist in space.
Yeah.
So, everything's, the saucer's cantilevered out. You got the spindly nacelles. You have to have that metal core.
Yeah. You're building a Star Wars ship. You're building it's all one thing. You don't worry about these things hanging out the sides, being parallel. They're going to support themselves. So it's.
But I also look at the armature, right? And these are like square brass tubes, right? They're
yes.
And you're soldering them together. I see there's there's angled supports at 45 degrees, and but it's not curved, right? The exterior of the hull has these complex and compound curves. So how does the external hull get mounted? Is there more additional structure? What can you walk me through? Where the mounting points are from a hull to your armature?
Well, the armature itself is basically the keel, which comes from the stand. So that the whole model is supported from a central point, which is the stand, and it's all telescoping tubing, so it fits within the other. So I can slide this down, and also provides a conduit for the power supply from the base into the model itself. But it's really the profile keel that you're building out of brass to support various components, whether it's the primary hull, which then you would then create a T, and then degrees off of, as you're going down the armature from the bow to the stern. It's pretty much just a linear flow. And as you get to the pylons, that's where it can get tricky. If you're building a standard TOS era pylon system, they come straight out of the keel, and you just create an angle. You graft it onto the hull, you're good to go. But when they start sweeping back at an angle, then math gets crazy. And but you can affix the keel at any point within the model if you have the hull components. Which, if you're building modularly, the primary hull is pretty much a self-contained system. You really have to make sure you're level with the keel at various points. And I use adhesive little levels, the little bubble levels I'll put all over the ship as I'm assembling the parts to the keel. So it's all going to be relatively level. And I use a laser guide as well, which I have mounted over my workbench, which I use to make sure I'm always square at some point. So I'm not eyeballing everything. I have got some sort of measurement to let me know that things are going together squarely. But you can work, away from the bow to the stern, or whichever way is best for you. But you can use either crossbars or whatever means you can to affix the hull to the armature at certain points. It's not just a free floating shell with a armature in the middle. At some point, it's got to connect each other, and so it's a rigid piece when you're finished with it.
Bill, you should talk about a little bit about how you do because when you're doing like the full scratch build model, when you're doing like the ribbing and the skinning, because that's fascinating, and it is like building an actual ship.
Yeah, like the Javelin shuttlecraft you see back here, right here, it's all scratch built out of styrene. And it's basically like a balsa wood model airplane, but made out of plastic. So instead of using balsa wood ribs, you use styrene ribs to generate a hull profile, and you then skin that with thin styrene instead of like paper like you would for a balsa wood model airplane, but gets you that kind of smooth contours that you would normally find on any other Starship. But that was before I got into printing, so it was all handmade the best way I could. That was kind of following that kind of old style balsa wood model airplane, or maybe even old world shipbuilding, where you have a wooden keel and you build bulkheads and you frame it, or you frame the outside with planks of wood. In this case, it's all plastic, but it's the same method.
So how difficult is that to do on, say, like the saucer section and getting everything to match up and everything? Is that like a lot of little wedges that you're making?
Yeah, actually, a saucer is pretty easy. You build a profile, basically a radius kind of half saucer, and you bring those around a central core, and then you start skidding that on top with circles of plastic you've cut from larger pieces, and you can just build up a conical section. They did that on the Endurance, which was a large 24-inch wide diameter saucer, and basically using radial profiles around a central point, creating the circumference of this saucer, and then cutting out rings of plastic to stack and create a top and bottom half of the Endurance that way. But saucers are a little tricky. You don't, at least I didn't have to create a kind of smooth saucer. I think I basically made a large cone, which kind of looks like it, but unless you're looking closely, you can't quite tell it's not quite curved. But you can still do it with layers of plastic and simulate that with the same method.
You said the armature, the brass, also works the conduit for wiring. Can you talk about some of the electronics that you put in here and some of the lighting that's available, and what kind of, where you source the electronics and that you use for the lighting systems?
Sure. A lot of the lighting I get is online, and the controller that I use is an Arduino Mini, and it's just a very simple board. I think it's like a $10 thing. I get that from Adafruit, and I have a program which I've been using on a lot of my ships, which I can customize. And I think there's like 15 outputs on this little board, which control all the navigation and strobe and pulsing and things like that. And I can control the timing on each one of those things to my heart's content. And each one of the ships will get one of those that would power all the blinky lights. The one back here, I think it's got 5 of them in there because it's got an entire interior as well, which said I got a cockpit with all sorts of lights that are going on and off. But I'll use anything from fiber optic to SMD type lighting to component LED to strip lighting, depending on what it is I'm lighting and how small it is. And I think for most of the cabin lighting, any kind of backlit large areas, I'm going to use like a strip light, because I can just do a light a large area very easily with 2 wires and just let it go. And I'll light that any kind of cabin windows using that source. But all the navigation strobe lights are all very small SMDs, and they come in in various sizes. You can get the smallest one, I think it's called a pico, and then there's a nano, and then there's a micro. And depending on what scale you're building, and I use those for my navigation and strobe lights. I can just drill a small hole and back that inside the model with one of these little SMDs and use a fiber optic as the lens on top of that, which is adhered to that fixture with a UV cured clear resin that I will just drop a little dab of that with a toothpick onto the fiber optic, hit it with a UV flashlight for about 5 seconds, and you're good to go. And there's my light. And they're much better than using a component LED, which the smallest you can buy is a 2 millimeter. And it was a little bit too big for some of the stuff I'm working on. But I did use them in the past, and they're easy to light. But what else do I use?
One of my favorite lighting things that you did is on various ones where you had the hanger and there's the actual deck lights that are like sequencing. That it just sells it so well. And like, were those fiber optics, or how'd you do those? Because those are tiny and in the deck.
Yeah, those are definitely fiber optic, and I think you're talking about the Endurance, which had these 2 rows of flashing lights, and there's only like 6 lights that power all of that, but there's 1,000 fiber optics all lead off of that. But I think I used one of the smallest diameters I could of the fiber optic and drilled all these little holes in the styrene deck and just punched all these fiber optic strands through it. And I would lens each top of each one of those fiber optics, so they were like little. You can sand them flush, so it looks like they just flow right into the deck, and they're all powered by 6 LEDs in sequence. But each one of those LEDs powers like 12 little fiber optics. So it looks like there's a billion lights that run down the deck, but there's only 6 lights that do it.
Wow. I'm trying to wrap my head around that. So you have Arduino board providing, your 3 volts or 5 volts to a very low power, very tiny LED, which means you're not going to get a ton of light bleed, right? It's very focused. And then even from that small, tiny SMD LED, you can spin off a dozen fiber optic channels. And then you can use your little resin trick to get it flush or get it sealed as a top layer lensing, and then sand that to get it flush, so you don't see any kind of evidence of the chain of different materials that you're using to make it look like a 1/350th scale embedded light on a floor.
Yeah, I love putting fiber optics just throughout a hull of a ship, just anywhere, just where I think it needs something, and you can just pop little lights on the hull where it's kind of boring. It's like, I want a little light there. I don't know what it's for, but it looks good. You can sand it flush, and then once after you painted it, and you can just take a little X-Acto and just scrape off the top of that fiber optic, and you would never know it was there. When you turn the lights on, it's like, whoa, there's a little pop of light on the hull somewhere. It's like, it gives you a little sense of scale. When you're working on something that large, and for a really tiny light source, it's like, what's it for? But this kind of helps sells it.
Yeah. And that's, of course, that endurance model you're talking about is your own design. You also, like you said, you work off of some existing kits. Do you have any favorites? Like, what's the world of Star Trek model kits look like today commercially that people can buy to modify or use as a starting point to build their own starships?
Yeah, well, I think that the TOS kit, you can build your heart's content, all sorts of things from that. And I've built quite a few of them, and I have a lot of them in stock. Every time I see them for sale, I buy one thinking I'll put it on a shelf, I'll use something from it. And it ends up not using any of it because I designed so much of it from my own self. But I bought a bunch of the new Pike era Enterprise models, and they're on my shelf. And I'm thinking that's another good source to kind of kit bash from and make other ships of the design, that new Disco Enterprise. And because I've not seen a lot of people customize that. They'll build it as is, but they have not built destroyers or the dreadnoughts using those kind of components. And I think that's another fun era to kind of play with. And I'm anxious to see what new ships we'll see in Star Trek Strange New Worlds besides the Enterprise.
Yeah.
We've seen one engine ship, but I'd like to see a lot more, because that's one of the things I like watching Star Trek for is the new ships, just as much as watching for new characters. But
yeah. And right now, the world of kits that people can buy, is it I know, is it Polar Lights and Mobius that have licenses? Who are the ones that are distributing?
Yeah, primarily for Star Trek, it's Polar Lights Round 2, who has a Star Trek license, and they've been putting on all sorts of cool new things. And actually, they had a table at Wonderfest, and they had announced that they were doing an interior for their new, or their newish 132 scale Galileo shuttlecraft, which when they first brought it out, it didn't have an interior. Now they've built one, and I think that's coming out later this year, which will, I think, replace the current version. So that the only thing you can buy is a Galileo with an interior. So that looks very accurate and very cool. And I think what else they've got coming out, but they also have licenses on Space 1999, and I think the Jerry Anderson thing.
Are there folks who are doing aftermarket add-ons or modifications that people can tap into, like photo etch, the more detailed parts or lighting kits for the sets that you mentioned?
Yeah, I think there are, for all the Star Trek kits and even other genre kits, you can buy quite a bit of aftermarket resin, decal, photo etch parts for accurizing parts for anything you can think of. And in fact, I'm building an older motion picture kit from 1979. And as inaccurate as that kit is, there is just so much out there that replaces it. They pretty much have almost nothing left of the original kit once you're done with it. But probably spent about $200 just in 3D printed parts and photo etch and you name it, just to make it look like it was supposed to have looked like.
Sean, I'm taking notes in my head for projects that we can do in the future.
Oh yeah,
because all this stuff is super exciting.
Yeah, something to do with Bill would be amazing.
There's a part that I'm working on this week. This is what's left of that's 1701. This is an original 1979 smoothie kit, but you can see all the work that had been done. Wow. It's adding those photo etch parts, and you have to resize these docking ports to the right size. Then there are templates to re-drill the correct holes and where they should be located, and on and on and on. But
I love it.
And it's reinforced on the inside with this because it's so thin that these engines are always breaking off with this really tiny little slot here. This is notorious for destroying this model because no one can ever get these to fit right. So this kit is going to be, also has an armature in it, but beyond that, reinforcing the thin plastic, which is 40 years old. So a lot of work.
What's your recommendation for reinforcing plastic like that? For backfilling it?
I'm using an epoxy sculpt. It's a 2-part compound that you can use as a putty, and it sands very well, but it takes about 12 hours to cure. And I'm using that to not only fill gaps and things, but to reinforce structural areas like this around the pylons, because it just hardens like stone. But you can still shape it, carve it, cut it, whatever you have to do to it. But it's wonderful stuff.
And you're not going to get any external cracking on your hull once it's all bound and sealed from the inside like that.
No, there's no shrinkage. There's no cracking of this material, which I prefer to use instead of any kind of putty. So any kind of even seams within joints, I'll use this instead of a putty, because you can work this for a couple of hours before it starts to set up. And you can use a liquid, which they sell, to help smooth it out as you're working it, so that you don't have to do any sanding or polishing at all. It's just ready to go once it's cured. And it's like concrete. I love it.
This is it's awesome. I think we're just about out of time, but we could go on for hours and hours. And your description of Wonderfest, Bill, it makes me want to go so bad. I've seen just pictures of people having so much fun there. Sean, it is absolutely on a list of places that we have to visit in the future and meet up.
Yeah, definitely. Before we go, I'll share this real quick. I realized I had some of the pieces of prints for those on the video podcast. This is a battle damage version, obviously. So this is the Picard era Stargazer. This is the saucer section that failed, and then these are the body parts. So you can get a pretty good idea. It was a big model, and four nacelles. Yeah, pretty cool.
I think each of those took about 8 feet of brass tubing to reinforce too.
Yeah,
I was buying brass like crazy when we were doing those.
But anyway, I thought people like to see that.
Yeah.
That's so cool. Sean, we're going to have you back at some point to talk about the modeling work and the printing work that you did on the Form 3L, and maybe we'll get to printing some ships at some point. But Bill, where can people find you online if they want to reach out and have questions about model making or about your work, like the Picard showrunners did, and getting your help there? What's the best way to get in touch?
Well, I'm on Instagram as Admiral Buck, and I'm also on Twitter as Buck Admiral, and also on Facebook just as Bill Krause. So those are the 3 sites that I'm primarily on.
A great follow on social media. Thank you for sharing not only your stories, but being so transparent about the work you do, the in-progress photos, and documenting the work. I mean, these aren't, Polaroids and VHS tapes. You're taking studio quality photos as well of the work, which shows that the pride that you have. It's all very, very well deserved. Well, thank you so much, Bill, for joining us this week, and Sean as well for geeking out about Star Trek, about model making, and the work that both of you did for Star Trek Picard. We'll have links to the places that we mentioned in the description below. You can always check that out on YouTube. But until then, we will see you all next time.